I will focus, like I said, on local government involvement in the past NECPs, specifically in the countries of the six pilot cities. The six countries of the pilot cities in this project. So this is Romain already presented this, so I won't go into any detail here. But this is just to say, obviously, there are the two key elements here for getting feedback from local level and other stakeholders is this public consultation process and this multi-level climate and energy dialogue. So the question is, to what extent did these consultations and dialogues happen in the previous process? So I'll give a brief assessment of this in the preparation of the first NECPs a few years ago, which is sort of a mix of an analysis from the European Commission's own summary. So like Romain said, the European Commission does an assessment of the strategies and gives some feedback, as well as some analysis from the documents themselves and from some partners from you as well in the survey that you filled in a few months ago about the NECPs. So I'll just go country by country. So with Croatia, first, when it comes to consultation, what we can see is that generally speaking, the NECP notes that local and regional authorities, entities participate generally in workshops on other climate documents and strategies that go beyond the NECP. And they also noted that there were specific electronic consultations online for the draft NECP that happened so in July 2019. And they also note that there was a meeting with regional energy agencies specifically on the draft NECP, which was also in July 2019. Although I would note that this is not necessarily kind of a direct involvement of local authorities, although regional energy agencies do have some kind of representation there. In terms of the public consultations, so these happened in December 2018 and 2019, but unfortunately the NECP does not actually provide much detail on this, on what the public's views were about this process, what they said, how these were addressed. So there wasn't actually information contained in the NECP really going into detail on this. And Rayan, in the survey circulated previously, like I mentioned, indicated that pilot cities and others were not sort of directly informed in a clear way of their ability to input into the draft NECP. But they did note that cities still managed to participate indirectly, and that some views were factored into the NECP nonetheless. When it comes to the multi-level dialogue, so like I mentioned, there were some workshops, but Rayan comments that there wasn't really a formal dialogue in place with cities, or that if it did, local stakeholders, that there wasn't a clear process for involvement there. And also in the NECP platform, which is a project that Energy Cities is involved in, which Melanie has spoken to previously. So some partners there confirmed that consultations did take place, but that this didn't involve local stakeholders, so that it was largely between the ministry and national energy companies or utilities. So kind of the overall view here is that there were some cities who may have been engaged were able to participate kind of indirectly in some way, but overall there was not very clear and sort of good national government coordination with the local level that was seen. In Czechia, so here again, there was reportedly an opportunity for cities to comment on both versions, the draft and the final versions. And this is essentially via associations that participated in a working group on the NECP. But again, here in the NECP, it notes that there was one plenary meeting that took place. So it's not necessarily kind of a more formal long-term process. And the associations that took place were the Union of Towns and Municipalities, an association of local governments. When it comes to the public consultation, here essentially the plan was published online on the ministry's website in November 2019. But of course, I would note that the plan was finalized by January 2020. So having about 2 months is not really a very clear process for ensuring that different stakeholders are informed, can put meaningful inputs and for those to be addressed. That process isn't very clear here. And the NECP itself doesn't summarize the public's views or how these were addressed in the NECP. And Starr said that in the survey that it was unclear to them the extent to which local authorities were informed or the extent to which they actually, were involved in this process and whether their views were taken into account. And in fact, they said that the NECP did not reflect urban action or, the local level at all, really. On the multi-level dialogue, so it appears that none took place. So the commission specifically in its assessment mentions that this should happen next time around, which is a strong indication that this did not happen. And Starr also confirms that to their knowledge, they were not aware of such a dialogue happening or being in place kind of currently. And so here, we see here that there is an overall kind of lack of a meaningful consultation between national and local authorities. So in France, in terms of consultation, here the NECP provides quite a lot of detail about different means in which there were consultations. So there's mention of debates, workshops that took place, different internet consultations and inputs involving various stakeholders. And the NECP also specifically mentions that summarizes this and adds hyperlink with further information that can be accessed in the public consultation process. Dijon also confirms in the survey that pilot cities and others were informed about the ability to participate in this process, but they weren't sure the extent to which there was active kind of participation from local authorities in this process. And when it comes to the multi-level dialogue, sorry, I'm going a bit quick, but there's quite a few countries to get through, and I don't want to take up too much time. The multi-level dialogue also speaks to the fact that there were several committees and working group meetings that were convened. The France's NECP is made up of 2 different plans, and that this involved kind of 86 meetings with different stakeholders from the public. And Dijon also confirms that beyond the NECP, there are a lot of committees and required consultations and other initiatives in France that require coordination and consultation between different levels of government for general energy and climate planning. And partners, though, in the NECP platform that Melanie is involved with did comment that that some of these committees with representation of local authorities have a bit more of a validation role. So it's not necessarily co-creation per se, but maybe more of a kind of reviewing it. And that also noted that there's actually almost so much consultation that there might be kind of it's difficult for authorities to be involved in all the issues. So overall, there were a lot of consultations and opportunities for dialogue in France, but there's a bit of uncertainty about how much concrete kind of inputs there were throughout the whole process. But overall, quite strong coordination. In Italy, so the NECP notes that there was a consultation that took place between different levels of government and institutions on the draft NECP, and that this involved local authorities. And so it specifically mentions a unified states, regions, cities conference. Again, here, this is just kind of one conference. It doesn't necessarily, there's no indication that this happened several times. And it also notes that there are thematic expert groups and there were public consultations on the NECP, which are briefly summarized in the final version of the plan. And Mantova said in the survey that cities were generally informed and participated essentially via city associations, which is the case in other countries as well. In terms of a multi-level dialogue, one could perhaps partially consider this, but at the same time, the conference I mentioned was kind of a one-off thing, and thematic expert groups themselves don't necessarily constitute a permanent kind of institutional process. So there is some question there about the extent to which that was satisfied. And Mantova also says that there is no formal kind of multi-level dialogue, and that beyond that, there's not really a formal process in place for local governments to consult with ministries, besides via associations and that's, yeah, aside from city associations. And that also Mantova noted that the NECP, while it does speak to having a specific governance model to improve coordination between levels of government, there's really no details in the NECP about this, and it's unclear the extent to which this was actually further elaborated. So some consultation, but not sort of enough formal continuous coordination and dialogue. And then for Latvia, there's actually a council in Latvia that develops the NECP, in which members have kind of direct voting rights on this. And interestingly, there actually is a city association that's in this council and does have voting rights. So this is actually quite an interesting structure to see. And Riga Energy Agency was noted isn't involved in this process in the council. They don't have voting rights, but they do participate in this council. And that generally speaking, it engages with different stakeholders. And yeah, the one thing that was noted as a kind of a downside was that municipalities were not directly invited to comment on the draft NECP, but only in the first iteration, but only after it had already been prepared. So between the draft and the final version. So it could have been initiated earlier on. And then in terms of consultation with other stakeholders, yeah, there were several conferences and online public consultations that are summarized on the relevant ministry's website. And in terms of a dialogue, this isn't clearly stated either in the NECP or in the European Commission's summary, but the fact this kind of council format and the number of conferences and presentations, I think, do indicate that there was sort of a form of dialogue, and Riga confirms that to them they would consider this to be a dialogue. And so, yeah. So overall, in Latvia, there were quite wide consultations with a number of opportunities for local stakeholders and others to be involved in this process. And now in Portugal, so the plan itself doesn't really provide details on how this happened. It does indicate that it happened, but it doesn't provide much information, unfortunately. And it does note that there were various presentations and thematic workshops that took place, and also speaks to the fact that there was sort of a final public consultation. But again, here we don't see any summary of the views, how these were taken into account in the final plan. And ENA does say that cities were involved about their ability to participate in this indirectly through sort of city associations. And finally, so in terms of the dialogue, ENA does confirm that this happened. So speaking to the presentations and workshops that I mentioned above, and that more generally in Portugal, there are different ways in which ENA and other agencies and associations participate in kind of planning more generally for climate and energy in the country. Speaking again to the NECP platform that Melanie is involved with, during the launch of this, the president of Braga did specifically say, though, that cities were not sufficiently involved in the NECP process at the time. So overall, here in Portugal, we see that there were wide consultations, but there is still some uncertainty of the extent to which kind of local priorities were reflected. So yeah, I'll end here essentially. Sorry, that was a lot of information. You may have some questions, but I think overall we see that there are sort of mixed or poor results actually in terms of national and local coordination for the NECP process. I'm not saying that the local level didn't do it well. I'm saying that the national government did not in most cases take sufficient initiative to involve a wide range of stakeholders in the consultation and process and establishing kind of a permanent institutional workshop. And that generally speaking, when inputs were made, it's not so surprising, but this happens usually through city associations rather than cities individually. So in some cases I mentioned, right, this was more of a formal process in France or Latvia. In others, it was kind of more occasional workshops and conferences here and there. So Italy, Croatia, and Portugal. And in Czechia, the process was not clear or perhaps kind of lacking. So yeah, and just to recall that this is maybe not surprising that pilot cities found that NECPs were not very focused on the local level. So from the survey previously, all pilot cities found that NECPs did not address urban climate action in detail, except for NI, which said there was a moderate level of detail, but everyone else said that there was little detail in the NECPs. So yeah, so this kind of begs the question of, okay, if the last process was not so successful, there's obviously some room for improvement going forward. And so with that, I think it would be, we could segue to Melanie's presentation to give some sort of concrete tips here.